Boardroom Bound, episode 125, How to be an Asset in the Boardroom and Maximize Your Value, with Eilleen Eisenman.
It's very easy for former executives to jump in to try to fix it, as opposed to keep pushing management by asking the tough questions and asking management to come back with potential solutions and then helping management understand the routes to take.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in a boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Eilleen Eisenman. This is someone who joined her first public board over 20 years ago, and since then she has served on all manner of boards. Think about privately held, startup, private equity, family, nonprofit, other public company boards. She's sort of been there, done that, seen it all, has some great tips and ideas about due diligence, how to bring your best self in the boardroom, how to network. You're going to hear all of that come out today. Let's jump into the show. Eilleen Eisenman, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Well, you and I were joking before we went on air that this is an episode long in the making, that before the world changed with COVID, we were already beginning to discuss it and things went haywire. So we're delighted to have you with us today. And there's still so much board stuff we wanted to cover then that we're going to cover now. And you have had such a wide range of experiences from pretty much any board type of manner that we'd want to cover on this show. You're thinking about like the privately held, the startups, the private equity, the family, the nonprofit, the publics. There's so much we're going to cover today, and it's going to be great to dig into all of those. But before we do that, I'd love to set the scene for our audience so they can understand your background and your experience and how that really is a reputation that brings many of those opportunities together for you. So let's start by talking about some of your career trajectory.
So I have one of those wonderful careers that's totally opportunistic and is sort of governed by the notion of throw it out to the universe, and the universe answers about what one's next step should be. I'm trained as an organizational psychologist. I have a PhD from NYU, and started off life as a consultant, because I had very quickly recognized that the life of an academic was not something that I aspired to. So I spent the beginning of my career consulting to CEOs and their executive teams, primarily around organizational transformation and CEO succession and transition. I worked with two firms, one Chicago-based, one Minneapolis-based, that really focused on the CEO, his and her, and at that time it was mostly his team, but sometimes her team, and how to really grow and scale the company. Periodically, I would join a major client who was going through a significant transformation and work on that transformation. And once it was complete, the idea of staying for maintenance purposes or stability purposes were not as interesting as the next opportunity, and so I typically went to the next opportunity. That took me through most of my career. Both I was senior executive in a number of publicly held American Express, a smaller startup, Enhanced Financial Services Group, which was a monoline reinsurance company, the Children's Place, going through an acquisition with the Disney stores that ultimately never took place. And then I had an out-of-the-blue call from a search firm asking if I wanted to be dean of a business school, and said no, but decided that I would go talk to them anyway. Never know where opportunities will lead. Mm-hmm. So I came out to Babson College, which focuses on entrepreneurship, became Dean of Executive and Enterprise Education. My first public board was in the late 90s, right when I had moved from consulting to my position at American Express. So it's been an interesting career.
And so how did that, I believe it was U.S. Tobacco, how did that public company board role come about for you?
So here, which is what happens very frequently, I was consulting to U.S. Tobacco. They were going through some significant organizational changes. I was their primary consultant. I was consulting to the CEO and his team, and they were going through a major leadership transition that I was helping them with around the next CEO. I then decided to stop consulting and move to American Express, and when I was at American Express, I got a call saying, "We miss you. Would you be interested in joining our board so we can still have the benefit of your advice?" Of course, that had gone. It was a great call, and of course, it had gone through a search firm. They had been looking, and they decided that they needed to have a woman on the board, and so I was a likely candidate because they knew me, and they knew that I understood their company and the challenges that they were going through. So it was a combination of, an executive search coupled with the security of knowing the individual in what was going to be a new role because it was the first woman they've ever had on the board.
Well, maybe that's a really interesting thread to pivot for a second and talk about one of the other, I would say, influential organizations you've been a part of, Women Corporate Directors, which you helped found. So during your time, for I think it was probably about a decade with your U.S. Tobacco, you helped co-found WCD. Clearly that perhaps experience where you're the first woman on that public company's board might have been influential. Can you talk us what that has been like? Because when we look back now from 2020, it's probably hard to imagine back in the times when there were, fighting to get women into boardrooms.
Excellent question, Alexander, and it really was an extraordinary time. When I joined the UST board, the search firm that I'd worked with said to me that there was a woman in New York, her name is Susan Stoutberg, and hopefully she'll be on your podcast, who was putting together a dinner group for women who sat on public boards. Would I be interested in meeting her? And so, of course, I said yes, because I knew no other women who sat on public boards. And what we discovered at that time in New York City, so this was 1997, we found 10 women to join us at the first dinners. And we literally, Women Corporate Directors, started around the dining room table in Susan's apartment in New York and grew from there. As more women joined public boards, we made a decision very early on that the requirement for joining was that you sat on a public board, because we really needed an opportunity to go offline and talk about what it was like to be the only woman, because all of us were the only woman. And we needed to be able to sort of level set about the experience. Was it because we were a woman, or was it because it was a public board? So it was a very, very helpful and useful group. And of course, Women Corporate Directors now has chapters in almost every country on the planet as well, and about 8,000 members around the world.
And I've had guests before that have broached the topic a little bit. For example, Cheryl Batchelor comes to mind, and she talks there's a difference if she's the first woman on the board versus, say, the second, maybe even a third, and how the cultures begin to change. She talks about first woman, well, then we stop having martinis at the lunches, and she talks about different things like that. In many ways, the conversation shifted, of course, to not just having women on the board, but we want diversity in all of its different forms. One example would be, we think about the laws that got passed in California, where they wanted to diversify, and we saw women added to boards, but they tended to be Caucasian women, right? And you think California is, 40% Latino and 0.4% Latinos on boards. So the world is still beginning to change and grow and develop. What's it been like in your experience watching boards as they diversify to change? In a sense, how have they changed as a board in the way that they've thought as an organization?
Well, I think that Cheryl's right. It makes a big difference when you're the only woman, and you need to represent all women every time you speak. And other board members tend to look at you in that way. And the minute you become one of two or one of three, which is in many ways the ideal, you become a voice as opposed to a woman's voice. And it makes a very significant difference for the boardroom dynamic. I'm proud to say that now on the DBI board, we have 5 women and we have 4 men. So it's an interesting balance. First time that it's happened, but the board represents our market, and so it's a very significant statement for the company's culture, which is a culture that supports diversity and inclusion, to be able to say that our board is a predominance of women.
And to be clear for everybody, we're talking about Designer Brands, public company, New York Stock Exchange. You've been on, I guess, about 13-ish years at this point. And that does sound like a
Actually,
right fit for that org.
only about 9 years. But
9 years, okay.
DBI is the parent company for DSW, the national shoe chain.
And your board experiences, I would call it professional now, portfolio in many senses of the word. So when you were on U.S. Tobacco and you're having that experience, was there a light bulb moment that you wanted and said, that went on for you and said, "Ooh, I want to do a lot more of these"? And if so, when that happened, how did you begin to think differently and perhaps start to position yourself?
Well, if you think back to the fact that I'm a consultant at heart and I'm an organizational psychologist, there is nothing that excites me more than understanding companies. And the reason I started as a consultant is because I am absolutely fascinated by the way different companies, cultures, dynamics either enable or inhibit the growth of the company. So being on the board of U.S. Tobacco puts you in it's a very different position for consultants, but in some ways it's an easier leap to go from consultant to board member than it is to go from executive to board member. And the richness of experience that consultants bring to the party in terms of their own mindset is to always be an independent voice, because your clients are paying you to raise issues, to ask the tough questions. They're not paying you to answer the questions and find solutions. And I think one of the challenges that one has when you move from an executive position into a board seat is you have to fight your tendency to be an implementer, and you have to remember that you're an asker, not a doer. And that's, I think, a tension that is very, very common on many boards in terms of when boards see their companies struggling, it's very easy for former executives to jump in to try to fix it, as opposed to keep pushing management to be, by asking the tough questions and asking management to come back with potential solutions, and then helping management understand the routes to take.
It makes a lot of sense. In some ways, though, it's interesting when you think about your board journey, you kind of jumped into the deep end that most people want to be swimming in who are listening to this podcast. Like, I want to be on the public company board. In many ways, you'd already checked that box, Eilleen. And we joked about this in the meeting. There's so many different types of boards that someone could pursue. And I wonder if at some point you said, you know what, I'd like to see what some of the others are like, whether it's sort of family or privately held or startup or private equity. Did you go in and pursue some of those? Did all of those end up on your doorstep? Clearly there's pros and cons to all of them. Would love to hear you sort of talk about the different spaces in the board industry, if I can call it that.
Surely. So like everything else, I throw it out there. I decided that it would be really interesting to balance my experience by understanding. So many people talked about the differences between being a director on a public board versus being a director on a private board. And I had gone to I keep up with governance information, have gone to lots of seminars and workshops on understanding the difference between the two. So started telling people that I was interested in joining a private company board, and was really intrigued by what the difference in the director role is. And it's a really interesting difference. In a public company board, the role of the board is to, at the end of the day, ensure appropriate succession of the CEO. And the board is responsible for hiring and firing the CEO. Of course, there's a million other responsibilities, but that's a primary responsibility where the CEO does not have the right to set the agendas for the board. In a private company, with the exception of an ESOP, the CEO sets the agendas. The board enhances the CEO's ability to make good decisions, but at the end of the day, the board cannot remove the CEO no matter what is happening with that company. The board serves as a very experienced and skilled set of advisors, but if it's a private company, even if it's a fiduciary board, they can raise the issues, but they can't remove the CEO. And that's important to understand in terms of one's status and the kinds of inroads one makes sitting in that boardroom.
And it's interesting when people start to try and wrap their mind around what a private company might look like. You might think a multi-generational company, and these can be massive organizations. These are not necessarily
Absolutely.
small mom and pops. And you think about some of the, say, different types of pressures and styles from, say, that organization versus, say, like a private equity-backed organization. It might be just really trying to beat the numbers into the best place they can be for whatever period of time before they try to sell the company, in so many different sorts of flavors and styles. I wonder if you could expand for a few minutes based on your background and experience, and maybe we tie this in wisely now to PDA from what that looks and feels like, and talk about your role there, because there's a lot that people need to learn to understand. If you've never worked, let's say you're being a consultant, if you've never consulted with a multi-generational family, that's a very different style than if you've always worked in a public company business. PDA does a great job at helping people understand these types of environments, so maybe we can talk a bit about that as well.
Absolutely. So last year, I started looking much more aggressively for my next private board seat. And a friend said, well, you should join PDA. There's a whole bunch of like-minded people, many of whom sit on private company boards, but really the focus is on governance of private company boards. So looked into PDA, found that the New England chapter, it was the Boston chapter at the time, was a very active and engaged, highly networked group of people who all came to the party with great credentials, great experience, great background, and great energy. So I joined PDA Boston last fall. I was asked to join the Strategy and Governance Committee based on my background. And then we were going through a CEO transition with the founding CEO had decided to spend more time focused on building his business. And I was asked to become the next president of PDA Boston, and we are now PDA New England. So it was a very quick transition into learning about PDA and its role, but I think it is an extraordinarily singular organization in its ability to really focus on the roles of board members in helping companies really grow successfully. In New England, our focus is really on board readiness across as the umbrella. It's board readiness for individuals to make sure that those people who don't sit on boards have an opportunity to learn the critical elements of what it means to be on a board and how to apply their unique skill sets. And for people who sit on boards, it's continuing education, and PDA University is a great resource based in our national chapter. And on the company side, it's board readiness for those companies who have boards and want to ensure that their board members have critically and up-to-date governance information. And for those companies that don't have boards, it's helping them understand the value of boards. Do they need an advisory board? Do they need a fiduciary board? And we also serve as a great resource to find really capable and competent board members. So we're sort of a free search firm for companies also who are looking to add to their boards. Very exciting time to be part of PDA.
Oh, the CEO, Alan Aldworth, was on an episode not too long ago, and we talked about sort of the hockey stick growth that we've seen in an organization. The pandemic in some ways has been influential because of all the webinars that were out there, and a great way for people to be able to access material when they couldn't get together in person.
Oh, absolutely. What was amazing to me when I joined the New England chapter was the fact that it started at the beginning of the pandemic, so no one has ever met each other in person.
Right. We've done a lot of Zoom meetings, but we haven't ever gotten together.
A lot of Zoom meetings. We've met, have made some good friends on Zoom. We're really looking forward to the day when we can all get together and have a drink together.
That's right. Well, Eilleen, I wonder if this is a great time to talk a little bit about, let's call it due diligence. If someone has a board opportunity that comes up to them, it's very different public versus private. You can imagine a public company, there's so much information out there that someone can find and listen to from the analyst reports and the recordings. There's a lot of public information. That can be a lot harder with a private company. And yet at the same time, and I'd love to hear how you've gone about this, you of course want to understand the board culture, the board's relationship with management. There's so much you want to think about before you say yes to make sure it's a good fit for you and for the organization. What's the guidance you would give for someone thinking about the private company world to consider how to do the due diligence?
So I think it's easier now than ever before to find out a lot about the company. It's really easy to find out about culture, customers, employees, just by going to the website and really tooling around to see what do they tell you about their company identity from the website alone. And then doing sort of massive Googling to find out what work they're doing in their communities, what outreach do they do, what types of people do they attract, what do their job descriptions look like, and using your own networks, particularly through LinkedIn, to say who knows people there. So that's number one. I would never even interview for a board as a public company unless I'm happy to sign an NDA, but I have to see their financials. I was once asked, I got a call about a private company board, and was setting up meetings, and I said, I would prefer to meet in a week or so because I need to look at your financials. I need to understand the challenges. If you could send me some strategy documents. And I was met with high umbrage on the part of the HR person who was setting up the meeting, saying, you have no right to know any of this. And I said, I'll sign an NDA. I'm not going to tell anybody what you're doing, but I can't go to an interview if you won't tell me anything about you. And this is for a board seat. So if you're not willing to trust me with information in advance, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be inside. She said, well, no one's ever asked that question before. And we're looking at other candidates. I said, well, that's my criteria for interviewing with your board. And she said, well, I have to talk to my CEO. I don't think we're going to give that to you. So this had come through a search firm. The search firm got back to me and said they didn't like your attitude. That is not a board I would want to join. Because if there was such resistance to sharing information with a potential board member to be able to evaluate what that board member could know in advance and the kinds of questions you could ask if you were informed, then it's a company that really doesn't want an active board. So I was kind of flabbergasted by that, but it's critical information.
Well, we could say that was part of doing the due diligence. You realized it wasn't a good fit for you. Right.
And it turns out I later found out that they had a number of really bad interviews, and they ended up deciding they didn't need a board. So those are the kinds of things. So to me, the answer about no, you can't have it was almost more important than seeing their financials. So it's investigating the intangibles, what can you find out? What can you know? What are the interactions? How do people relate? And how, what are the expectations if you have the interview? What are the expectations of the CEO? Why does the CEO of a private company have a board? What's his goal for the board? How does he use the board? Does he use the board as advisors to their respective functions? Does he use the board as a sounding board? Does he use the board to be, a stamp of approval? All those kinds of questions are critical in making a determination if this will be a good fit.
And it's really interesting because I think many people have this sense that, well, whenever I get offered the first board seat, I should just take it because it's so hard to get it. And I think you follow the process you laid out there, Eilleen, to make sure it's going to be a good fit where you will enjoy the experience, add a lot of value, build up your reputation, and odds are high you're sitting next to other people who are also serving on other boards. And when they see you working in an organization, hopefully that you're passionate about bringing your A game, they will realize this might be a good person that I should consider for other opportunities that might appear. And I imagine you've seen that at play either from yourself as you're sitting there looking at other board members, perhaps subconsciously going, oh, Ted, that could be really useful for this other board role I know about, versus perhaps people have thought about for yourself.
Exactly. Some advice I got from somebody, which was great advice, is never join a board whose product you can't endorse. And so when I joined the U.S. Tobacco Board, and U.S. Tobacco has since been purchased by Altria, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Harvard Vanguard and Atrius, whose board I was on. When I joined the UST board, it's smokeless tobacco. And people said to me, how can you join a tobacco board? Well, it wasn't a cigarette board. I felt strongly that I could not join a cigarette board. And I met extensively with their science advisors and read reams of reports about the health and safety issues of smokeless tobacco. And what I came to understand was that smokeless tobacco does not cause mouth cancer. People believe that it does, but it doesn't. And UST had never lost a lawsuit based on the science of mouth cancer. And in fact, Sweden has the lowest rates of oral cancer in the world, and they have the highest rates of smokeless tobacco in the world. It's superheating of tobacco, which is a causative agent in mouth cancer. So I did the research because I needed to be able to look at my kids and say, yes, I'm on a tobacco board, but here's why, as opposed to I'm on a tobacco board, no, you can't smoke a cigarette, but I can sit on a tobacco board and look like I was being hypocritical to my children. So it's really think through what the product is.
Well, Eilleen, I'd love to come back for a second just to pivot back to the private board stuff we were talking about before. And it sounded a bit of the motivation, probably very intentional, of being a PDA member was not only to add value back to other people and learn for yourself, but to do some networking as you're going about it. You're talking about sort of like eagerly, aggressively looking for private company board seats. Just if you could give a sense for our audience what that looks and feels like, because for many of us, we're thinking about, okay, I need to have all my board documents lined up. I need to know the elevator pitch I want to share, be able to talk to the contacts I have, but I probably need to network with other people. What does that process look like for you as you are trying to network to find future opportunities?
I think that, and what I tell people is just be very, very clear and concise about what it is you're looking for. If you say to a person, I'm looking to join a board, there's no call to action for that person, and they'll say, okay, interesting. If you say to somebody, I'm looking to join, if you're talking with somebody in a particular industry, and you say, I'm looking to join a board in this industry at this stage of maturation who are dealing with these challenges because I have the skill set to help them deal with those challenges, can you help me? Do you know any boards or do you know anyone who I should talk to? That's a specific call to action. It's not just being vague about, gee, I really like to join a board. Well, everyone wants to join a board right now. That seems to be the thing that people want to do. Tell people what you need so they can be helpful. And be explicit and don't be embarrassed to ask. Because part of it is about reciprocity. What you will always find is that somebody says, well, and you can help me with X. Or ask that person, if you do this for me, I'm asking you to do this for me, what can I help you with? Sometimes it's, many times people call me and say, I'd like to rehearse my board pitch, or can you take a look at my CV, or I'm about to have an interview, and would you, can you help me decide what questions I should ask? I'm always happy to do that. So it's setting up the expectation that you would like somebody to help you do X, and in exchange, you'll do something for them that's important to them. But being clear about what it is you need.
I think that specificity is critical, and I like the way you described it there, that everybody can follow and understand, figuring out their own niche that they're targeting and why and how you add value to it. For me, it's very simple. The answer to confusion is no. And I don't want to ask the person on the other side of the phone or the video or the coffee chat that we might actually get to have someday to burn calories to figure out what I want to do, because it's not a good call to action, as you just described.
Right. Yeah, because people don't know what you want them to do unless you specifically give them the guidelines for what that ask is.
And something else in my mind that I want to make sure we cover today, if I just totally pivot way back to our conversation about women corporate directors and Susan, was it sounds to me, as much as you've been pursuing some of the board stuff, you've also been using some of your spare time on another passion project of yours where you wrote a book. And I want to make sure we get a chance to talk about that today.
Oh, well, thank you. So Susan Stelberg, who was the founder of Women Corporate Directors, and I, 3 years ago, decided that we had enough free time. I had just, air quotes, retired from my role at Babson College so that I could pursue boards and some projects around entrepreneurial ecosystems. Susan had effectively turned over the keys to Women Corporate Directors, to KPMG and to the foundation. And we just realized that a very common theme of people we talked to was betrayal. And so we decided to look more into it, and we ended up writing a book entitled Betrayed, A Survivor's Guide to Lying, Cheating, and Double Dealing. And to do that, we interviewed 50 people who had been betrayed both professionally and personally, sometimes one or the other, sometimes both, and gathered stories so that we could look at core themes. What we discovered that there was nothing out there in the marketplace that really focused on resilience and how do you get past the betrayal, and really looked at what the common themes of betrayal were. So what we did was we started off by believing that we would have different chapters devoted to different types of betrayal. And what we recognized very, very quickly is that there's only one type of betrayal. It's that somebody violates a trust, whether it's in a professional setting or a personal setting. It's a violation of trust. And, betrayal is the shadow demon of trust. It's always lurking. It may not come to pass, but it's always lurking there. And so we've pulled together the book with the themes. We look at the nature of betrayal, why it hurts so much. We look at red flags. We look at what to do in the moment of betrayal, which is never give up your power and own your own narrative, both for personal and professional reasons. It's critical. We look at the value of revenge. We looked at the value of forgiveness. And most of all, we looked at how do you get to the next step, which we call bouncing forward. And in fact, I'm doing a PDA webinar on May 25th looking at, it's entitled When the Tone at the Top is Betrayal, looking at one of our case studies. And I'll have people who call in go into breakout groups and act as if they were the board, where the CEO is betrayed by his CFO and his president. And then the board had to opine on what to do. So it's a really common topic. And what we learned, we were afraid originally that people wouldn't tell us stories. What we've learned is that we could probably write seven more books and still have enough stories to tell. Because people are desperate to tell their story of betrayal, and they always thought it was embarrassing to be betrayed. And now people realize the value of talking about it and putting it in perspective in order to move forward.
Well, I'll use the words bounce back that you said there. And I think a lot of us feel like we could be bouncing back after the way the last year has gone. And I think you've given us some great advice that we can all use today, Eilleen, as we think about how do we take the next steps in our board journey. And we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you so much, Alexander. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Eilleen Eisenman. It's a treat on the show to talk to someone who's run the gamut from board experience. Clearly, many people are thinking, I want to be in a public company board, and that was Eilleen's first major board role. After that, she tried some of the others. We think about family-backed, private equity, startup, so many different types of opportunities and experiences. And of course, Eilleen is doing a deep dive into the private stuff today in her membership role with Private Director Association, helping lead the New England chapter where I'm a member. Now, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources, including signing up for Eilleen's upcoming PDA event. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.